1997 was the centenary year of the East Fremantle Football Club, and at a gala dinner to celebrate the occasion, they named their team of the century, and named at full forward on that side was George Doig, the greatest goal kicker ever in the history of East Fremantle's football club. And he was known as the Bradman of football, and rightly so, because his record is unbelievable. He played 9 full seasons of football for East Fremantle Football Club. In that period of time, kicked 1,088 goals. That's an average in excess of 120 goals per season, which is quite incredible. He kicked a century of goals in every season, every full season that he played, and kicked his 106 goals in his first season in 1933 with East Fremantle when they won their 17th premiership. He kicked 152 goals in his second season with East Fremantle, bringing up his century in that season in the 16th round of fixtures, and kicking 45 goals in the last 6 games of that season, and 152 goals at that stage was an Australian record. He kicked 144 goals in 1937, and that was a great season for East Fremantle and George Doig, and for Western Australia, because they hosted the Australian Football Championships at Subiaco Oval, which attracted big crowds, and West Australia going down in those championships by just 8 points in the final game against Victoria. He kicked 146 goals in his last season with East Fremantle in 1941 before World War II intervened, and that was the end of George Doig's career. He came back and played again in the 1945 season and played just 8 games as a 32-year-old, kicked 23 goals and finished his career with 1,111 goals in a fabulous career. And George, I don't know where we start with all this, but it has certainly been a wonderful career. Let's go back to your school days. Pretty hard at 84 years of age to remember a lot about your school days, but were you a star player at school?
No, I didn't play a lot of football at school. Most of my football was played with kick-to-kick at Fremantle Park and the Fremantle Esplanade. We always had a football in the house, and being associated with family and football, it was a natural thing to go down there after school every day and have kick-to-kick.
And you had a fair bit of family to kick with?
Yes, we had family. I had cousins that lived in the next street to me, and it was a regular thing with the boys in our street to go to the Esplanade at Fremantle and watch the seniors that trained there and have kick-to-kick ourselves.
Now, you started your football then in the Fremantle Suburban Association with East Fremantle.
That's right. I played, I followed the Fremantle Suburban Association games with the hope that sometimes I might fill in for East Fremantle if they didn't have sufficient players turn up. And quite often I played in bare feet and shorts and just to get a game. And from that year, that would be the first year that I approached anything like senior football, and from there on I played the full year the next year in the association.
How many seasons did you play in the Fremantle Suburban Association?
I played a few games just to fill in, and then 1 full year the next year.
And in one game, George, you kicked their total score?
Yes, I'd kicked most of the score halfway through the second quarter, and they decided it'd be a good idea to play to me all the time, which I did do, and strange as it may seem, I finished up kicking the whole score of 26 goals 20.
That's quite incredible.
Yes.
And you started with East Fremantle at 20 years of age. Now that's...
Yes, I started when I was actually 19. I turned 20 in the May. That was in 1933.
And what a way to start a career in league football, George. 106 goals for the season, and East Fremantle won their 17th premiership.
Yes, it was a good year. I was a little bit wondering whether I would be fit enough to play in that type of league, but I started off playing full forward against East Perth on Fremantle Oval. And strange as it may seem, somebody rang me recently to find out which full forward kicked the most goals in the first game. And it turned out that it was me. I kicked 9 the first day, which was quite credible in those days.
Now, when you came into that East Fremantle League side, were they all new players to you, or did a lot of your teammates come up from the Suburban Association?
We had, I think it was 7 new players in that year. We had my brother Charlie, cousin Edgar, cousin Norm, Freddie Mann, the father of the current Mann player, plays in the association here now, Vern Donegan, Joe Migro. That would be just about the lot. I think there was either 7 or 8.
So there was a lot of new faces around.
A lot of new faces, and all young too, all in around the 20 mark.
So, but 20 years of age by today's standards is a late start in league football.
Yes.
In those days, did people start about 20 years of age?
Well, some of them did. I think the ones I can recall a little bit later on that played in under the 20 was probably John Todd and John Jerovich.
Now, 1934, that was a very big season for you, George, because you broke the Australian record, kicked 152 goals, brought up your century of goals in the 16th fixture.
Yes, I had a good year that year. I started off, you know, kicking quite a few, and it just seemed to be kept going.
Yes, and what were your main attributes, George? I mean, you were what, 5'9", and you weren't even 11 stone, I don't think.
No, when I first started, I was just over 10 stone, and I put on about 7 pounds in that first year, and I finished up just a shade over 11 stone when I finished.
And were you always a full forward?
Always a full forward, yes.
And what about the full backs you played on? I mean,
Well,
come 1933, 34, when you'd established yourself, did they start leaning on you a bit?
well, they did, but of course you only played a couple of games a year against an individual fullback, and I preferred to play against a good fullback rather than an unknown one, because with a fullback that was prominent, you knew what they were going to do all the time. But with a raw bone, you'd go to run one way and he wouldn't know, and he'd run straight into you, sort of business. But much of a muchness, I should say. 3 or 4 would probably be outstanding, like Lou Daly, Freddie Batt, and Cyril Jennings was an old timer with South Fremantle. But I never had much difficulty, really. Speed I had, and the ability to mark on my chest. And I think they were the main attributes.
And you obviously were very accurate. I mean,
Oh, yes,
the records show that your ratio goals against points was 4-1.
Yes, well, I could kick with both feet. That was one of the benefits. No fullback knew which way I was going to go, because I could swing either way. I could kick goals over my head. I could kick them from standing or angles or anything. It didn't make much trouble. I was pretty accurate with the kicking because I never got too far away from the goals.
What was your favoured kick?
I kicked all my goals with a punt kick. I never kicked one drop kick goal in 1111.
What, a drop punt or a flat punt? Or
Flat punt, a torpedo punt from a long distance, and an ordinary punt from anything short.
George, you really got to know about football, an actual football, didn't you? I mean, they tell me you were a magnificent snapshot. You could kick the ball on one end or the other and screw it through the goals.
Yes.
That must have come from a lot of use of the football in the past.
Well, a lot of practice. We practiced to kick left foot and right foot. I could kick left foot or right foot just as good as one another. I could kick torpedo punch with my left foot, torpedo punch with my right foot, snapshots with either foot, just exactly the same.
And in the grand final in 1934, you lost to West Perth. Can you remember much about that?
34? No, I don't recall a lot of the individual games. I don't recall a lot of it. I don't think we got beaten by much, if I can recall.
No, well, you know, West Perth and Claremont seemed to be a real nemesis.
Yes, we drew with them in one, drew with Claremont in one final. I think it had to play off again, or a grand final.
You played in nine seasons, and in the 9 seasons you played in 6 grand finals, won 3 of them.
Yes, that's right.
And what about 1937, George? That is a great interest to me. Would you rate that maybe as your best season? I mean, you kicked 144 goals, you won the premiership, you played in the Australian Football Championships here. That was between South Australia, Victoria and Western Australia. The 3 games attracted 79,000 people, and at the final game, when West Australia lost to Victoria by 8 points, 38,800 people at Subiaco Oval. Very big crowd, but it must have been right at your top in 1937.
Yes, and yet I rate my 1934 season as one of my best. I kicked 152 that
Certainly.
year, but I did play well in 37, but I more or less looked towards getting a century, not specifically getting a century, that I would get a century each year because I was playing full forward all the time. And naturally, I had the opportunity to kick more goals than anybody else.
George, it was an era of full forwards. I mean, the 60s were the era of the ruckman, with your great Jack Clark from East Maitland and the likes of Polly Farmer and so forth. But in your era, coming through the 30s and the 40s, the era of the full forwards, because there was a lot of them around, wasn't there, in each state?
I think it was the type of play. We kept the game more open. It was my tactics to keep the 2 forward pockets in the forward pocket so as to give me plenty of room to move around. If they did come in, well, they always assisted me. I had good players playing to me. I had players like, in my early years, Bert Butcher, Clary Reynolds, Billy James, and players like that. You knew you only had to run and you knew the ball would be on your chest when you got there.
So in other words, they were kicking to position and
To a
expecting you to
position,
be there.
they knew I'd be there. And I never got out of a position where I didn't know where the goals were. I kept the goals, a vision of the goals in my mind all the time, that I knew that I wouldn't be in a position where I couldn't kick a goal.
So you obviously made a real study of full forward, and really, when you look at the great full forwards, they were all specialist full forwards.
That's right.
Like Bernie Naylor and Austin Robertson after you,
Yeah.
and yourself, and
Ted Tyson.
Tyson. Were you aware of what was going on in other states in those years? Like Bob Pratt was obviously a star in Melbourne, Kevin Farmer in South
We
Australia.
never even worried much about the eastern states in those days. The only time we got involved was if we played in a carnival or a stateside. You get involved on how the others played. But as far as seeing them play, you had no television to watch them to see how they played. You just got your information really from the paper.
And what about, like Jack Regan was a great fullback.
He was a great
the
fullback,
VFL.
yes.
You played on him a few times?
I played on him, yes. He was, somebody asked me if I ever marked over Jack Regan, and I said, yes, I did, at Leaderville Oval. And they said, how did you do it? I said, well, I just marked over him and that was it. Just the opportunity came up and of course I had to do it, and I did it.
Did you really enjoy playing state football?
Yes, I enjoyed it, but it was, travelling was the hardest part. You never had the facilities that you had at home, but I enjoyed it.
And you went by train?
Went by train, yes.
And how many times did you play on the Melbourne Cricket Ground?
I think I only played twice. I went with one trip from East Fremantle to Sydney, and they recalled me from that the East Fremantle side to play again in Melbourne. And I played on the South Australian Oval, Victoria and Sydney in that year, which was quite an experience.
So interstate football was almost the pinnacle of those days.
It was.
The West Australian National Football League, as it was known then, was a very strong competition, wasn't it? And
yes.
And you had how many Doigs actually played for East Fremantle? I mean, I know there was 5 brothers played at one stage.
I had my father and 4 uncles played, and then my brother Charlie and myself.
How good was Charlie?
He was good. He was
Centre
good.
man?
Yeah, centre man. He won the lead medal in his first year, which was the best player for the year for East Fremantle. And then there was Bill Norman and Edgar, and then on the other side of the street lived the other Doig family, and was Ron, Jim and Dave. They all played too. We had the 3 families within a range. You could have thrown a stone on the roof from either place.
Incredible, really. And Charlie Doig, I had the pleasure of playing under Charlie Doig in 1960 when he coached Swan District.
Oh, yes, he did go and play.
And we only won 1 game that year, but I always thought that he set us up very nicely for the next year when Hayden Bunton arrived, and we won 3 premierships in a row. He taught us, almost was the finishing school, and he knew a lot about kicking the football and kicking it sideways and what the football would do, and it was a skill that must have been inherited by the Doig family. They must have made a real study of what that football would do for them.
Yes, I think so. He told me once that when he coached Swans that he wanted to get a top-class rover, which he did do. In that case was Bunton, and it made all the difference in the world.
Yes, very true.
And although he didn't win many games when he coached, he did get a lot of praise from Swan District people.
Oh, he's very popular up there, but of course Bunton came in and he did a lot of good work in that year, and all of a sudden they did very well. But George, you didn't win a Lynn medal?
No, I never won a Lynn medal. I won quite a few votes, but I never ever got in the top.
It's incredible, really, with the record you've got.
Yes.
But it just shows the strength of East Fremantle football.
Well, they had good players. They had, like young Subert was a young player that came in. Pardon me. And I think he might have got 2 Lynn medals. Kit Subert, he was a good player. And of course, when you look through the Lynn medalists, you can see why they got Lynn medals, because they were all top-class players.
Well, Bob Jarvis was another player.
That's right.
Top player.
Yeah.
That's incredible in my
Rogers.
opinion. But another incredible situation is simply the fact that you change coaches so often. I mean, in your 9 years, you changed coaches 6 times.
That's right.
Now, Jerry Dolan won the premiership with you in 1933 and was replaced by Bob Jarvis for the 1934 season. How do you explain all that?
Well, I think it was probably maybe to keep Bub in the game. He was one of those players that was more or less half-hearted. He was a champion, but sometimes he felt that football was taking too much of his time, and he wanted to get out of it. And I think they said, well, we'll keep him here, we'll make him coach.
And then he was replaced the next year by Barney Sheedy.
That's right, yeah.
And that was father of Jack?
Yes, father of Jack, the best drop kick of all time, I should say, Barney Sheedy.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And of course he passed it on to his son, didn't he?
He did. He coached us, and he used to kick drop kicks to me for practice. I used to run straight at him, and he'd kick them from 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards, and he'd hit me dead on the chest every time. Never kicked them high, straight on the chest. Of course, that was home for me, because you get somebody kicking a ball like that, he taught the others to do the same. They kept the ball low and landed it straight on my chest.
Yeah, incredible. And Jack Sheedy inherited that because that was a feature of his game.
That's right, yeah.
Now, Ross Hutchison stayed longer than anybody. I think he coached you for 3 seasons.
Yeah.
And won a premiership, of course, in 1937. But he was one of the great coaches at East Fremantle.
Oh, he was, yes, yes. It was a toss-up between Ross and I for the first year he coached. And I think Ross was going to move, and they asked me to pull out, which I did do. It was between Ross Hutchison and me who got the job as coach, and I pulled out.
And you did coach in 1940?
Yes.
Did you enjoy that experience?
Yes, it didn't interfere with my playing anyway. We had a good lot of chaps. I think that made the difference. We had friendly football team, and they were all very, very good to me.
And you lost in the first semi-final in 1940.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Now, Claremont had an enormous run, didn't they, in that period? They won, I think, 3 premierships in a row. And they had some very great players.
Oh, my word. I think next to Bob Jarvis, one of my selections as one of the best players was Sammy Clark.
And very highly held still in football.
Oh, he was a great player, Sammy. He could do anything.
George Maloney?
George Maloney, another one. There was Jackie Hooper, was a rover, and Jim Reed played on the wing. He was about 6 foot, I should say. He was a speedster, and he could kick the ball for 50, 60 yards every kick. He was a champion.
Are there any other great players you'd like to mention? I mean, there were so many of them around in those days, and it was most unusual for them to move interstate in those days, wasn't it?
Yes, well, I'm a little bit afraid of picking good players, because you pick aspects that you think of at the time, and you suddenly think of somebody else that was just as good. So I rather decline from picking one, although Bub Jarvis was my idol overall, as far as... but when I look back at some of the players, like in opposition, there were some fantastic players. I always remember Don Marinko. He was in opposition to us, yet he could put the ball on Ted Tyson's chest every kick. He was a left footer and as accurate as you could possibly get.
They've got something going for them, the left footers.
They have.
Did many of the players in those days kick with both feet, George?
No, there was a few.
Now
I've got an idea that one of my uncles was a left footer.
But I go right back to, say, Popsy Hill. He's nearly the first player I saw that I couldn't decide whether he was a left or right footer for a long time.
Yeah.
But before then, it seemed that you either kicked one foot
right
or the other.
left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
No,
the
I
same with
think
handball.
probably with being able to kick left and right, I think I'd probably as good as anybody, because it didn't make any difference whether I kicked it left or right.
And I was reading where often you would interchange and slip over to a forward pocket if things weren't going well.
Oh yes, if I got knocked about a bit, which I often did, I'd change with Bert Butcher. Bert Butcher was played in the forward pocket. I'd switch over him for 10 minutes and he'd rough it up with somebody that would rough me up, and he'd come back and I'd go back to my position. Clary Reynolds had come from half forward, take over my position as full forward. I'd go and play in the half forward flank for 10 minutes.
Would your fullback go with you?
No, fullback never ever followed me.
So the fullback was the fullback regardless?
That's right, regardless. And it's a strange thing, we made those moves without any reference to the captain or the coach.
Well, you wouldn't have had a runner in those days.
No, never had a runner. And not only that, I don't know whether they ever appreciated the fact that we changed, but they never ever said anything.
What would the coach say if you made a change like that?
Well, if you made a change like that now, they'd take you off. They'd send a runner out and take you off.
So you had to use a bit of initiative?
You had to, yes.
Did the captain play a part? You didn't have to go to the captain?
Didn't have to go to the captain, we did it automatically.
Yeah, it's a nice way to be, isn't it?
It is.
And I think that's treating people like adults.
Exactly, yes.
Now, what about Victoria? Did you have any offers to go to Victoria?
Yes, I had a couple of offers. Indirectly, I had a written invitation from St Kilda.
Was that unusual, to get offered to go to Victoria in those days?
No, there was a few players went to Victoria. I remember Eric Glass went to Victoria, and then there was quite a few went to South Melbourne when Fall, I think, was captain coach there. There was Johnny Bowe. He went to Melbourne. I think it was about 5 West Australians went to South Melbourne.
Was there money involved?
I thought it was a job more than money. When I had the offer from St Kilda, they couldn't even offer me a job. They'd helped me to get a job, but I had a job here, and I thought, well, it's no good giving up a job here to perhaps go to Melbourne and not have a job at all.
So you made a decision not to go?
So I made the decision not to go. There was no money incentive to go at that stage.
And what about, you played on the MCG, how did you find the surface there compared to our...
Well, I found it when I played that it was very good. A little bit heavier than our ground. The worst ground I played on in mud was South Australia, where they re-stopped all our boots on one match. Long leather stops. Right. But they were a drag because you carried about half a pound of mud on each boot.
Well, that's exactly right, and that used to happen to us even years later.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd go to the Melbourne cricket ground and they'd give us about 1.5 inches stops, leather stops.
Yeah.
And by quarter time you couldn't pick your legs up.
Exactly right. And you had all that mud on your boot when you went to kick. You couldn't wipe your boot because it was clogged up under your boot.
Now, 1941 was your last full season with East Fremantle. Kicked 146 goals. Must have had a great season, but it must have been some sort of disappointment when the league decided on an underage competition during the war years.
It was in a way, but it was fair. I missed the 3 years, but when I did come back in 45, I only played a few games, but I was 32 then. And of course I wasn't as mobile as what I was earlier. And the only practice I'd had was just practicing with the juniors, helping the East Fremantle in one of the junior sides.
Did you play anywhere, like the underage competition was 42, 43, 44?
Yeah.
Did you play anywhere in those years?
No, I never played at all. Just had a few kicks with the juniors, that was all.
That must have been pretty tough after, I mean, football must have been a big part of your life leading up to that.
Oh, it was, and it was a bit of I didn't want to go back to play those few games, but East Fremantle ran into a bit of trouble getting enough players, and both Bob Jarvis and I went back for those 8 games, and we finished up, we won the premiership.
Won the premiership.
Yeah.
8 games, 23 goals,
Yeah.
finishing with the grand total of 1,111 goals. And I
Yeah.
think, to be precise, your average per season, 123. George, that's Bradman-like.
Thanks, Kev.
So you've really had a marvellous career. Now, just before we get off 1945, a whole new era. New players came in. Ebbs, Conway, Mears.
That's right.
A whole new ball game.
Yes, different altogether. Completely changed then.
And how did Bub Jarvis and George Doig fit into all that?
Well, we were, I suppose, used to playing football, and I think you get into a pattern and you more or less stick to that pattern. Didn't make any difference who you played with. You stuck to the same pattern of play.
George, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I know that you've made comment on this, but I want you to think hard and tell me who was the best footballer you ever saw.
Well, I go back to Bob Jarvis all the time. I think he could do everything that any player could do, plus a few other things. And they punch the ball now. Well, Bob Jarvis punched the ball in his day of playing. He could punch the ball, come through, and punch the ball 20 yards. And you never saw any other player punch the ball like he could. Well, they never punched it, really. But he was an absolute champion. He could mark, he could kick, he could tackle. He could do any mortal thing that was required of a good footballer.
And George, who's the best coach you played under?
Well, there you are. I had a multiplicity of coaches. I suppose you'd stick to Jerry Dole, and I think he'd probably be the most experienced, but they were all good.
George, it's been an outstanding career. Congratulations, and thanks for being with us.
And thank you, Keith, for having me. I've enjoyed the talk, and thanks again.